an original.
From Story Studio Network.
Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
It's showtime.
There we go. They're on their feet again. Every Friday morning that happens. Welcome in. It's On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. And lots to talk about this week. I'm Dave Trafford for Story Studio Network. Sabrina Nanji is here from the Queen's Park Observer. John Wright, our numbers guy at the Maru Public Opinion, and Mr. Keith Leslie from CH Television in Hamilton. And you know, I was just, before we got on, Keith and I were chatting before everybody kind of jumped in the studio, and I was saying that I have spent probably 50 hours in my windowless studio this week. It's just been one of those crazy, insane times. And Keith was commenting, saying, you know, so many people just haven't been out in public because of COVID, and we've just got into that routine. And that occurred to me this week in spades, because I did two in-person events. But one was the funniest one, was the folks at the RCAF Foundation had launched a brand new book. It's called Pathway to the Stars. And just a plug, by the way, we're going to run our podcast for the RCAF Foundation next week in the Now and Next feed. And it's kind of some cool stuff about the history of the RCAF, some of the characters and so on. But I'm sitting there as they're going through their routine. The moderator for the conversation was Rod Black. Rod and I have had conversations for, I don't know, years and years. It's the first time ever we've met each other in person. So that was one thing. But there's a guy sitting next to me, and he's in, you know, decked out in the uniform and so on, and he's attentively watching what's going on and paying attention. By the time it's over, I just kind of poked him on the shoulder, and he turned around, and it's our friend John Wright. And I realized I hadn't seen you in like almost a year in person. The last time was at the Remembrance Day service at Mount Pleasant last November, a year ago.
Yeah, it was delightful to see you, especially with your hat and coat and everything. We were both in uniform, and it was a great event. So thanks for your contribution in terms of just getting those podcasts done. They were previewed not only that day on some of the different platforms that we were on, but also I guess we do have Remembrance Day coming up on a Saturday this year, which is a little different because then you don't get the school kids coming out, but should be a wonderful day. Yeah.
So for those of you who are in the Toronto area and you want to make the observance, I would suggest you go to the mausoleum at Mount Pleasant. It's a different vibe to the whole thing, but it is the RCAF's specific Remembrance Day service, and if nothing else, you get to see the William Barker Memorial there. And if you don't know who William Barker is, listen to the podcast Now and Next coming up next week, and we'll let that hang right there. All right, lots to talk about. Sabrina, I know that you've been sort of, I could just tell from your newsletter every day this week, you're kind of frothing at the bit every day because there's no shortage of nonsense. Where do you want to start? Do we start with the document dump, or do we go just more recently to the economic update?
I mean, it's funny because when I was getting like my 7,000th coffee of the week this morning before I came on, I was thinking, like, kind of refreshing my memory on like, okay, what do I want to talk about with you guys? And I had to think about the document dump, which feels like a lifetime ago now. Like,
doesn't
so
it?
much
Yeah.
has really happened this week. Even just in general, the past few months, I feel like it's really never been a busier time in Ontario politics. But I guess maybe we'll start at the beginning, which, yeah, okay, let's say this document dump, I think was probably, you know, the biggest news this week, just because, I mean, there's 7,000 pages, almost 7,000 pages in FOI documents. That's Freedom of Information documents that like you or I, anyone with $5 can file to get information, government information that, you know, the public has a right to know. And so environmental defense and some of those activists had filed this whopping FOI document that was going to be released that the PCs were actually bracing for, and it seems to have preempt some more policy changes on the housing file. But essentially, these are just, you know, more shedding more light on the, the Ford government's land use planning policy changes, in particular on municipal urban boundaries, which, days before this big package got released, Housing Minister Paul Calandra reversed course on that, citing too much involvement from the former minister's office, kind of similar to what we saw in the Greenbelt. And then we sort of saw with this document dump what Calandra meant by too much involvement. And I think, there's a lot of process being bypassed and sort of similar things that we saw happening with the Greenbelt now reversed too. But I think my biggest takeaway from this document dump was that the premier, it showed us for the first time the premier's office direct involvement in this. And, there were lines from the former housing minister's chief of staff, Ryan Amato, saying things like PO, short for premier's office, wants this done. And, there are a lot of specifics to dig into on this, but really, I think that was my biggest takeaway. Meanwhile, Premier Doug Ford held a press conference right after, denied everything, completely changed, evaded questions, changed tack every way he could. And so I think this just raises a lot more questions than answers. This is not a headache that's going away anytime soon.
So, Keith, I'm looking at Sabrina's newsletter from, I guess, back on Tuesday morning. And one of the quotes that kind of jumped out and I saw in all the coverage was from Ryan Amato and declaring to everyone involved, everyone keep your mouth shut, re the Greenbelt fallout in the media. So clearly there was a sense in the inner circle that there was fire around them first, that this was, a challenge, but the implications here, including the fact that this went to the PO, the Premier's office, this went right through the government.
Absolutely.
So for the Premier to stand up in front of the media and say, I knew nothing about it. Okay, well, now we're back to the Steve Clark scenario, aren't we? I mean, if you knew nothing about it, then what the hell were you doing? How could that possibly be going through your office and you not have any sense of what was going on?
Well, the documents just put lie to that statement, quite frankly. I mean, the documents completely contradict the Premier's statements on many files, that he met with the developer at the developer's mansion where he had a party fundraiser for the PCs. The Premier came in and spoke. He asked him about, the host asked him about getting some Greenbelt lands changed, and then we see later memos. Premier needs to stop calling this guy was one of the things. Then there's another, as you say, from Ryan Amato to the civil servants, not to the political staff, to the civil servants. Keep your mouth shut. Because we're having to create new criteria to make all these lands eligible. They're changing all the rules. Those documents, as Sabrina said, there's a lot in them, and there's a lot redacted even in them. But they do, as I say, they contradict the government's statements and positions on so many things. This is clearly why Calandra acted just ahead of the release last week to get to say, okay, those forced municipal expansions, we're rolling those back because they were done the same day as the Greenbelt expansion. That's coming back because the process was just clearly as tainted and as bad as the Greenbelt land swap process was. It's all the same day. It's all the same players. These documents prove that, and they take the trail several times right to the Premier's door. So there's just no getting around it. The Tuesday news conference by Premier Ford, the first one he'd had since he did the climb down 6 weeks ago in Niagara-on-the-Lake about the Greenbelt thing, which we had discussed before as one of the worst news conferences we've ever seen a premier do. He topped it. This one was worse this week. His inability to pivot with a grace, just, because first of all, he was there to announce the 10 cent a liter reduction in the gas tax was going to continue for another 6 months. No questions about that, because we're not talking about that. We're talking about the Greenbelt and how it's contradicting your stories. And every time he's, did you lie to the integrity commissioner? He comes back with, the federal interest rates are too high. Olivia Chow is a wonderful person. And it's just dancing all over the place. But when he got, pushed, he was getting, the reporters were getting tough and saying, this is contradicting you. Did you lie? Did you mislead the integrity commissioner? You can't make that accusation, claimed the Premier. The integrity commissioner cleared me. The auditor general cleared me. Well, as we've discussed before, yes, because they have to accept your word. The RCMP, which has started interviewing staff at the Ministry of Housing this week, does not have to accept your word. They can probe further, and that's exactly what's going on now. So the news conference did not help the Premier at all. It didn't help the Tories' messaging, because the only good thing they were going to have in the fall economic statement Thursday for affordability was that 10 cent a liter gas tax thing. They put it out on Tuesday to try and deflect or change the channel from the document dump. Did not work at all. And then when we came to Thursday's fall economic statement, what's the headline? Nothing for affordability. So it hurt them all the way around. They're not handling this correctly, and it's not going away anytime soon.
Yeah, I suppose, John, if there's, sort of a political thread, that's a silver thread in the lining of all of this, is that, oh, look at this, by, election year, we're going to be back in balance and we're going to have a surplus on the books. In any other political year, that might be, okay, that's a good flag to be waving. But I'm finding it increasingly difficult to see a path where this government gets out from underneath, never mind out in front of this situation, because it's gone from Greenbelt to Quagmire.
Yeah, and it's not going to go away anytime soon. I mean, it's a menace to the government, right? You can't predict where it's going. You just know it's going somewhere. It was interesting. I was out last night at a function, and one of the reporters from Queen's Park, well, there were a few of them there, but one of the reporters said to me, I wonder whether or not we're beating this too much and that people are going to be exhausted by it. And I thought that was an interesting statement, because they're caught in this din, and it's a never ending kind of spiral.
I'm sure that was a managing editor that was asking that
question.
No,
these were the battle hardy people like Sabrina. I mean, they're right in the front trenches dealing with this stuff. And I just kind of looked at them and I said, you know what? This is going to be an unfolding onion, right? Like, it's just going to peel back layer after layer after layer. So, I mean, I don't think the public is fatigued. I think the public knows that it's going on. It's kind of in the back of their minds. But I said two things about it. Number one, I think they need to, if I were a government, and my feeling on it right now would be kind of like, let's just get the hell to Christmas and get out of here. Like, this is rag the puck time. This is do whatever you can. But you're in the front trenches, you're under heavy salvo, you're going to take a lot of casualties and a lot of injuries, and you got to get out of there. So that's the first thing. Number two is, I don't think you can deflect much. You can't change the channel and turn up the volume much. And secondly, Dave, I have to tell you, I don't follow that much about the individual provinces. I have a really good handle on what's going on nationally with the economy, because I publish a number of major reports every month on the economy. So I know where the Bank of Canada is, and, taxes and all that GDP and housing and all that sort of stuff. I got to say, I was shocked when I read yesterday. Like, I had to do a real serious double take when it said, we have a huge deficit. I didn't expect that at all. I was interested, however, this morning when I'm reading most newspapers, It's not the headline. It's buried in, from the lead. It's way down. In fact, in the Globe and Mail, it's kind of near the back of it. By the way, we're going to have this $5.3 billion thing. So I think, even when you've got something bad news, I'm not really sure that they intended to go out and tell everybody that, that it is bad news in order to blow the other one off the front burner. But I then started thinking, well, this is kind of interesting, because on the one hand, they're talking about a huge deficit. On the other hand, they're giving breaks on, gas and taxes and a series of other things. Like, there's an incongruency to it all as well, a bit of a spinning in the room as well. So I'm not really sure where that's going to go. All I would say is, this is not going away. It will be the never-ending story. Number two, I think the only thing they have to do is to get out of the house as soon as they can and shut down for Christmas and all that sort of stuff, and put together a program for the spring, which I don't know. I'll yield to you, Sabrina and Keith. I'm not sure when they'd go back, but the first thing they have to do is go back with a budget. So, I don't know whether they prorogue a throne speech or mix the deck up even more with ministers, but it seems to me that January, February, and March are going to be the times that this government tries to get a new platform and maybe some new people under and a new narrative. But until that time, I can't see it happening.
Yeah, I wonder, Sabrina, what that downtime over the Christmas recess is going to be like, because the premier sure got an earful from his caucus over Greenbelt and had to roll it back. Is this next recess going to be what transforms the front benches, or the approach that the government's going to take generally all over again by the time they come back after Family Day?
Yeah, I think this has kind of been pointed out already, but I think they're just going to kind of lay low and try to ride this out. I mean, there's really not much on the agenda right now, and so they'll get everything passed before the Christmas break, December 14th. But I do think that a reset is, one option they might take too, just because. There's a new lieutenant governor coming in, Edith Dumont. And I mean, just part of that process is that she would get to make a speech from the throne. So there is like speculation that this could just be an opportunity for the government to maybe try to reset. But I do think this isn't really going away, and they're going to need to try and make up with the public. Like we had sort of seen polling, them slipping in the polls, I should say, when people were aware of what was going on with the Greenbelt sort of in the early days of this back in the summer. And that's the summer, so people were still paying attention and people weren't happy about it. And then we saw them change course. I do think though that I don't think this thing is going away, but I do think though that the Ford government could get out of this by, like, they have enough time by 2026. And I think the one big if and the one big hurdle to come to that is this RCMP investigation, is that if there are charges, I think that is really something that's going to stick in the public's mind. We've seen it happen to the Liberals. And there are many police investigations, that we're still talking about the gas plants and whatnot. And so I mean, that's a pretty big if at this point, but there's a lot more information to be revealed. I mean, the Auditor General is looking into MZOs. That's coming out in early December, their annual report, looking into MZOs, Ontario Place, what's going on there. And so I think, these are obviously organizations that have a lot more leeway, I guess, when it comes to getting, government documents and government information. And so I think that, I'm not saying, we know already that something untoward happened. I'm just saying there's a lot more light to be shed here. And so far it's just resulted in negative headlines for the Ford government. But I do think that, a reset could be on the horizon. In terms of the fall economic statement, I mean, yeah, it was bad news, but there was really nothing done for affordability. And I think that could have probably been an opportunity to maybe switch things up a little bit. But as John and Keith have pointed out, this really isn't going away anytime soon.
So one of the things that could have been a neat little positive nugget was the announcement around the Ontario Infrastructure Bank. But as soon as that came out, Keith, the opposition jumped on it and said, this is just going to be more pork barreling, more of this, that, and the other thing. And rightly, I think, pointed to the Canada Infrastructure Bank, which was stood up, I guess, in 2017, 2018, whatever. But it was talked about almost immediately as soon as Trudeau took control in Ottawa, that this is what they were going to do. There was all kinds of controversy around who had their finger in the pot then in terms of standing that bank up. There was $35 billion. That was sort of the chunk of money that they were going to use. I haven't heard anybody yet be able to explain to me what it is the Ontario Infrastructure Bank is going to do. And I was working with the P3 group when all of this was talked about for the Canada Infrastructure Bank. And I got to tell you, I'm still a little fuzzy on exactly what the hell they do there. All due respect to Aaron Corey, smart guy from Infrastructure Ontario, now runs the infrastructure bank, the Canada Infrastructure Bank. But the idea was that they were going to incentivize private investment in new infrastructure that generates revenue or significant cost savings, right? So, okay, but even there, that seems really vague.
Oh,
and we've
man.
already got problems with P3 in Ontario to begin with. So I'm sure that some poor bugger has been working on this for months and said, this is going to be great. It's going to be great. Oh, shit. It's not the time to be releasing this.
I watched Minister Bethlen Falvey's speech. I read all the documents. I listened to the briefing. I then watched him do several interviews. Many questions were asked about this bank. And we are not very clear on what's going on with this bank at all. Basically, the province is setting aside $3 billion in seed money to create, as you say, a sort of counterpart to the Canada Infrastructure Bank, which is fairly new in itself and took some years to get off the ground. So Ontario's going to set up its own. I love the interim Liberal leader, John Fraser, affordability, and they come back with a bank. A bank. The incredulity of it all was just so obvious. And I think to many Canadians, what? A bank? And
that's a priority.
That's a priority. And as the opposition parties say, it's just going to be loaded up with PC insiders, maybe developers, donors, who knows? Well, another bureaucracy is going to be created instead of joining onto the federal bank. Anyway, the whole idea, as you say, is to attract institutional investors, many of which were pension plans, OMERs, municipal employees, teachers. Many of them are based in Ontario already, but we need this $3 billion in seed money to get them to put money into infrastructure development projects because the taxpayers can't afford to do what all the government says. And they're talking about things that have a revenue stream, as you say. So long-term care home. Can't be highways because we don't want to toll the highways, but it can be affordable housing. Really? How are we going to get your revenue stream out of affordable housing? Below market price? I don't see how it's going to work there. Who's going to be responsible for making sure that these investors get the profits that they'll be looking for? Taxpayers. I mean, it just seems to be, at the very least, there's no clarity at all about who's going to be on the board, how it's going to run. It's going to be an arm's length agency. What's it going to do? Where's it going to attract investment? And specifically, who's responsible for guaranteeing, it's going to end up being taxpayers. We all know that. And that the institutional investors are looking for steady revenue streams and good returns on investment. Well, I don't know. This doesn't seem to be what Ontarians are looking for at this point. And how is this going to help you meet your goal of building 1.5 million homes? The document, the Fall Economic Statement, proved they're basically at half the rate they need to be to get homes. And the deadline is 2031, so it's closing in quickly. They're nowhere near getting there. That $3 billion could have put some affordable housing perhaps together, some below-market housing that could go for co-op housing, for low-income, all these different things. And this government, Minister Calandra referred to such an idea of a government building housing as something out of communist Russia. Governments used to build social housing in Ontario not that long ago. And when they got out of that business, we ended up with a housing crisis. So this government will not even consider it, but they're going to set up an Ontario Investment Bank or infrastructure bank. At $3 billion. I'm sorry, I think that seed money could have been much better used to address the housing crisis or even, shortfalls in funding for healthcare, education, and social services. Putting it into this bank, which is going to attract who? Party insiders and friends are going to get appointed to this board? What projects? It just all seems like, I don't know, a potential for boondoggle, potential for just, even more. And as the opposition parties say, there's no trust in the Ford government, given the Greenbelt scandal, to have them set this up right now. There's zero trust in them to do this.
So, John, that's the problem with this, right? I mean, because there's no detail, we fill the void right away with possibility, speculation, or, the worst case scenarios. And if they had come out and said, we're going to use this to incent investment in sort of small nuclear facilities around the province so that we have, deal with energy, or that whether we're going to, whether some specific thing to hang it on, but just to say we're going to do, there's $3 billion out here to attract investment in infrastructure and then float affordable housing. Keith's questions are all bang on. I mean, there's no answer there.
Well, two things on that. First of all, the Canadian Investment Bank has already got the nuclear stuff tied up. They've actually got investments going on in there, so it's not an area that you could look at. But to your point, I mean, if you say infrastructure, then that's kind of what you would think. When I hear infrastructure, though, I think of bonds. I think of, putting long-term, revenue into something that is going to have a return at some point. It's a safe place to go, but I guess what the government was saying was we're going to talk to all the pension funds as well. We're going to get them involved in this sort of stuff. I mean, when I look at this from a political point of view, it's not a bauble that's going to distract from the current situation that everybody's following. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I'm not really sure it was big enough to actually set the government on a new course. I've said this before. I think the most brilliant piece that I ever saw done was in 1980-81. It was the lead up to that election. I was just a wee intern at Queen's Park at the time, and actually I saw David Warner at this reception last night. It was remembering him sitting in the back row yelling "Resign, resign" at the top of his lungs. Anyways, but I remember then, and Hugh Segal and Ed Stewart, who was the Secretary of the Cabinet, put together this thing called the Board of Industrial Leadership and Development. And it was a very broad-based, completely thought out piece, as only Hugh Segal could do. But when you looked at it, the Board of Industrial Leadership and Development was Build Davis. Like, it was the initials, and it went forward. Like, there was even a political angle. We didn't even get the foundation of Record for Development, which would have spelled Ford as an acronym here. So there wasn't really that there, but I wondered why, again, when you rightly say the government is taking $3 billion out as seed money when you're already projecting a deficit. I mean, to the common taxpayer, that doesn't make sense. That it's, you can explain what it's supposed to be, but it doesn't make sense. And secondly, I did think it was a really narrow area. Like, I'm not really sure what it's going to do, especially when you say, I'm not sure what it's going to do, and we're going to put it up, and it's in a sea now of a whole bunch of other organizations set up by other levels of government that you're now in competition with. Like, it just seemed unclear and almost hasty in putting it in the window where somebody said, we got to have something else here. So I think, it might be just a reflection. Again, I come back to Keith and Sabrina on this. It might be a case of reflection when political staffers and those who are trying to manage something are caught in a political blender. It is just spinning. They just, it's an exhausting time where even if you want to do something, you're fatigued from being hit from 6 a.m. until 2 a.m. It is just relentless. So I wonder whether or not there was anything here which just this is a portraying a government that's exhausted from it all. It's not going to get any better. But as I said, that mid-December point where you can get out of the house and take a big breather, I'll bet there's a lot of people who will be, heading off on a trip. Maybe not to Las Vegas, but, heading off on a trip somewhere.
Well, I would refer everybody to Sabrina's newsletter if you want sort of the blow-by-blow, the TikTok on what's gone on with the NDP in the last 2 weeks, because you've been really, I don't know what phase you were up to, a 170 odd, whatever it was, in terms of the new developments in that drama. But all of this is happening while the Liberals quietly go about their business and get ready for their leadership decision that first weekend in December. What are you hearing there?
I mean, I'm still hearing that Bonnie Crombie is the favorite to win now. It's really crunch time for everybody. And don't forget, just a few days, like literally 2 days before we find out who's going to be the next Liberal leader, there's a by-election happening in Kitchener Centre. And so I do think that's going to be very interesting. It's very interesting timing. Because it sort of just came up very, very quickly. But yeah, I mean, I think the NDP going through all its problems, amid the Sarah Jama ouster and Kitchener Centre, that riding association in particular, essentially calling on Marit Stiles to resign over it, and, them wanting to hang on to that seat. I think it's going to be very interesting. The PCs have a guy who doesn't even live in the riding and has spoken out against the party machinations in the past. Meanwhile, who was just nominated like days before the by-election call, by the way, whereas the other candidates had been nominated for months and have already been like pounding the pavement, knocking on doors. And so I think if this is going to be really interesting to watch the Liberals in particular, because they're feeling galvanized because of that leadership contest, and the Greens too. I mean, the Greens have been really pushing hard in that riding, putting all their resources there. They've got this like crack campaign team that's used to pulling out, the few wins we do have in this country for the Green Party. And this is also Mike Morris's riding federally, and he made history by becoming the first, Green Ontario elected to the Hill. And so they're really pushing their candidate, Aisling Clancy. So I would watch the Greens and also the Liberals. I mean, the Liberal candidate, Kelly Stice, I actually just interviewed her this week. So stay tuned next week for what she has to say about it. And as well with Debbie Chapman, the NDP candidate. But essentially, Kelly Stice, the Liberals, I think a lot of people are also looking at her. She's known in the riding. She ran last year. She came in third behind the NDP and the PCs. But she's, working against the backdrop of the Liberal Party leadership. And so the Liberal Party is feeling very galvanized right now. I mean, whoever takes the crown, it's been a crowded race. They've all raised a ton of money. The Liberals raised more money than any of the other parties in Q3. They've got a lot more members. There's over 100,000 members who are going to have a say in this leadership contest. I mean, turnout's never 100%, but that's a lot of, that's a big party, you know, that's bigger than they've been in the past. And so I do think that I'm still hearing Bonnie Crombie is going to be the favorite, but I guess unfortunately, and maybe this was a little on purpose from the PCs, it's happening 2 days before the next leader takes the crown. So really they won't actually be able to take credit for whatever happens in the by-election if they win. But yeah, there's a lot of exciting things happening that we'll be covering. I still don't think it's enough to change the channel on what the Ford government is dealing with, but definitely some exciting stuff happening before we all leave for Christmas.
Well, if nothing, it could pose the opportunity to intensify what's going on the front burner for Ford Nation at Queen's Park. All right, that'll do it for us this week. Keith, Leslie, John, Wright, and Sabrina Nanji. I'm Dave Trafford. This is On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast for Story Studio Network.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.